Morning, folks. I've been wondering what the effect of Trump's tariffs will be on the reserve status of the US dollar. So, what does it mean when you have the dollar as your reserve currency? Well, everyone who imports anything into the US never really concerns themselves with exchange rate risk. You simply buy whatever you buy in US dollars, no matter where in the world it comes from, creating a huge amount of stability locally. The second thing is you never have to worry that there's going to be a shortage of the currency, or that you're sitting with too much currency that belongs to someone else and you can't get rid of. So the US finds global trade extremely easy. The amount of friction is very low. Now, the reserve dollar status, this extraordinary benefit that the US has by having this reserve currency, means there has to be enough dollars around to ensure that the whole world has access to those dollars when they wish to trade. Because, of course, countries who are not trading with the US will very often still trade in the dollar. And if there are not enough dollars around, that would be a problem. And so the effect is that the US gets to print more currency than it needs, but it gets to send that inflation all over the world instead of concentrating that inflation in its home country. And so typically what would happen is if you were importing a lot more than you exported, then over time what would happen is your currency would depreciate in value. That would make your imports more expensive. But because of this reserve currency status, that mechanism doesn't really happen. In other words, the US dollar is far stronger than it would normally be if you didn't have the whole world using all of these dollars. And so the way the dollars get into the world is the US prints more of them and they send it out as they buy stuff, whether goods or services, and that is how it flows back. And that is how the money gets into the world. But after everyone has received their cash, they don't necessarily want to get rid of those dollars and convert to something else. And so what they do with those dollars to retain them and still earn an income on them is they go back to the US and they purchase US treasuries, which are essentially bonds. So this is the US government borrowing money from whoever wishes to lend to them. Because the demand for these treasuries has been so high, the interest rate has been very low. Why do people keep wanting to lend to the US when there are such low interest rates? Well, if you think of it like a bank, because you're pretty sure you'll get your money back. And so, perhaps in your personal life, you could lend to someone and receive a much higher interest rate, but you send it to the bank because the bank's not going to disappear with your money, at least in theory. And for as long as that holds, the US is very attractive. Now, when Trump goes and imposes these huge punitive tariffs on the whole world, a few things occur. The one is, over time, the US will import less. I mean, that's in fact the stated intention. They want to make more stuff at home. And when that happens, just like anything else that sees its price rise, people do less of it. So there should be less importing. On the other hand, the countries who are very unhappy with Trump's position, the bigger countries will retaliate. And in fact, some have, like China. But the smaller economies don't really have an option to do that, or certainly not at scale. So if we have a look at the other side of this equation, which is where did the dollars go after you've been paid? Many of them go back to the US. They enter back into US circulation in the form of debt. Now, this is an incredible privilege for the US. You get to pay very, very little to raise this debt. For the most part, the US does nothing to settle its capital account. In other words, the actual amount of the loan. All that gets paid is the interest, which means the very difficult political conversations that are happening in South Africa at the moment, when we are not collecting enough tax to cover our costs, and now we have to have tax raises. the US gets to dodge that very difficult political conversation because the rest of the world effectively gives it money. And because it's not paying back that capital and only settling interest, you can think of it as the rest of the world basically donating money to the US and in return receiving a low interest rate. Now, that interest rate is starting to rise, and this is becoming an increasingly large problem to the US. So the interest to be paid in the course of 2025 is around $1.1 trillion. That is about 17% of total US revenue collected. And so the scale of this debt has become huge. The interest rates are rising on that debt, making it more and more expensive. And what Trump has now done is slowed down the economy, I predict at least. He says not, I don't see another way around that. And so when we get to the point of the US dollar as a reserve currency, it requires, number one, enough dollars circulating in the rest of the world. You cannot have all of those dollars circulating in the US without pushing up inflation fairly dramatically. Number two, you need people to trust in the dollar. And the US needs to keep its debt costs low. So if people don't want to lend to the US, then the price of that debt has to go up. In other words, the US has to pay a higher interest rate, otherwise people will not put their money there. And these issues truly underpin why the dollar functions as a reserve currency. If they start falling apart, I think over time this becomes harder and harder to sustain. So in my view, Trump has done more to de-dollarize global trade than I think anything that China or Russia or Iran or anyone else could possibly have done. Please be sure to subscribe to receive updates to these videos. I'll be posting more in the next few days. Have a wonderful day.